Do you even need real amps in a studio anymore? Let's talk about it. Yo, what's up? I hope you're doing well. So that tone in that demo you just heard was created on the Quad Cortex. That was the first time I ever used it, but I just used it like I would create a normal signal chain if I was to use real pedals, real amp, real cab, real mic, real mixing. So first I started with a gate, and honestly this gate is one of the best that I've heard. It clamps it down dead quiet. You don't hear any buzz from an amp because obviously it's not a real amp. And it reacts with no latency just like a pedal would because you're plugging into a hardware amp simulator. And then I added an overdrive pedal just to tighten up the low end and keep things sounding tight and clear. And then I picked my amp head. Then I picked my cab, speaker selection, mic placement. Then I did a little bit of light mixing by adding a little bit of compression and then adjusting a little bit of EQ by taking out anything that's rumble information on the low end, taking out anything that's just fizz in the top end, taking out some harshness between 3 and 4K, and then adding a little bit of AK to bring out the clarity and add a little bit of bite. So did this save me time if I was to do it with the real thing? Absolutely 10 billion times yes it did. I don't have to carry a heavy amp head right next to my desk, adjust the settings, hurt my back, run back and forth between the control room and the live room, and then patch in some hardware to do a little bit of compression, a little bit of EQ, and then bring it into my DAW and set the level correctly. That's a ton of work, so in that sense, the Quad Cortex makes more sense. But does the Quad Cortex sound real? It sounds great, but no, it doesn't sound real. I worked in a studio for 2 years that had probably 30 amps, 15 cabs, and every mic selection you could think of, and the biggest difference I hear between the real thing and any sort of amp simulator right now is that there's always like this weird digital fizz on the top end that's sort of like a snapshot of what the tone is, and I'm not sure what that is, but I can always tell when it's an amp sim or amp plugin. And then also, it doesn't react the same way. So like when you're doing palm mutes, it doesn't like woof and pump in the low end the same way that a real amp would, and you don't hear that air between the mic and the speaker. But just because it doesn't sound real doesn't mean that it sounds bad. You could crank a real Roland 120 to try to get a metal tone out of it, but that's still not going to sound good. It'll sound real, but that's not a metal tone. When I was recording in that studio with all that gear, I would still track with Amplitude and write with Amplitude because I wanted to keep the creativity flowing. And then when we were done, I would take that DI and reamp it through a real amp. That way I didn't have to commit to anything while we were tracking, and we didn't have to spend a ton of time tone searching because we knew that at the end we could pick our final distorted tone throughout the entire record. Now here's my issue with the Quad Cortex and things like the Kemper and the Axe effects, and why I'm not totally sold on them. I could be wrong, but from what I understand, you can create your perfect tone through this incredible amp selection and pedal selection, and it sounds awesome, but when you go to record, you would still have to split a DI just in case you wanted to change the tone later. But to me, that's almost as much work as reamping a real amp. So why wouldn't you use a plugin like Amplitude or Guitar Rig or the Neural stuff, which is also great? It's essentially the same thing as the Quad Cortex, but in software version, and you don't have to commit to a tone. Well, people will say that the Quad Cortex sounds better. Yeah, it sounds great, but it doesn't sound that much better than Amplitude, and it doesn't sound as good as the real amps. So why would I use that if I have to commit to something and reamp later? Especially if I'm recording somebody else's record. I want them to have every option available, and then at the end, if they don't really like the overall tone that we have, I don't have to reamp 16 guitar tracks, which isn't out of the norm. So imagine a 10-song record at 3 minutes each, that's 30 minutes, times 16 guitar tracks. I don't know what that is. Let's say it's 10 million hours. I don't want to spend 10 million hours reamping a tone with less gain through a Quad Cortex, when the whole reason that I got the thing is to have the option of every pedal and every amp in the world and all this mic selection. But none of that really makes sense if I have to commit to the tone going in and I can't change it halfway through recording. Now, obviously the Quad Cortex is great for a live band because you can carry it, it's not going to break your back. It costs basically as much as a head and a cab together, and of course you have that huge selection of pedals and amps. But as far as recording, we're hitting sort of a weird time where studios are sort of broken up into either you're a studio with real amps and real cab and real pedals with unique gear, or you're a Quad Cortex Axe Effects hardware amp simulator studio, or you're a total plug-in studio where efficiency is really the #1 goal. So let's break it down into 3 options and see which one makes the most sense for you. So option 1 is use a software sim like Amplitude or Neural, Guitar Rig, or any of the other great cheap plugins out there. The pros are it's cheap, you can change anything on the fly, and you have every option of pedal and amp right in front of you. The cons are it might not sound as great as the Quad Cortex and definitely doesn't sound as good as the real thing. And there's also that stigma of when a band walks in the room and they don't see all these amps and all these cab, or even a Quad Cortex, they can sometimes think, hey, I can buy this plugin at home and make it sound just as great, which isn't always true. But so to me, option 1 makes sense for any producer who's more focused on writing and production and creatively mixing and creatively doing heavy lifting with bands. You probably won't be set up to do live tracking for bands and won't do traditional pre-production. You're probably more the person that does a heavy lift for a project and really helps find that sound for the band and helps write from the ground up. Now, option 2 is using a hardware amp sim like a Quad Cortex, Axe-Fx, or Kemper. The pros are they sound great and you have access to every pedal and every amp there ever is in the entire universe. It costs a little more than Amplitude, but it doesn't cost as much as the real thing. The con is it's basically a real amp. Once you create your tone, you're set to that tone, and if you want to change it, you have to reamp. So to me, option 2 makes sense for a middle ground option for a lot of producers. You have a ton of selection for pedals, amps, cabs, mics, but maybe you have a real cab setup so that you can track a better sounding tone into a real cab and pick your pedals, or maybe you run some real pedals into the Quad Cortex, and maybe you just pick your amp head so that your studio is more focused on the pedals and the cab selection and the mic selection than buying a bunch of amp heads that really only do one thing. And especially if you work on modern rock type music, I think that the Quad Cortex makes a lot of sense for things like metal and rock. Option 3, which is my favorite, you get real amps, real cabs, real mics. The pros are it sounds like a real record and it sounds great. You hear the air between the mic and the speaker and there's something magical about that. And you can still always record DIs and use whatever amp sim in your computer and reamp a real tone later if you're afraid of committing to a tone as you're going in. The cons are, depending on your selection, it's really expensive if you have 4 or 5 heads, or like that studio I worked at that had 30 heads. That's basically a yacht, and it's also very loud. So if you're not set up to have a live room and a control room with separate rooms, it's going to be very loud when you're reamping or tracking guitars. And some people don't want to sit in a room and wear headphones all day while they're recording. So I think that option 3 makes the most sense for a traditional recording studio that does live pre-production tracking and has different bands come in all the time. And option 3 makes the most sense if you own your own studio and other producers aren't working there. To me, that's a big reason why you wouldn't pick option 3. When I worked at that other studio and we had all that other selection, I would have to break down my mics and break down my pedals and break down my amps after every time I used it. So if I wanted to recall sound for a mix or reamp in a couple days, I just couldn't do it. It's a ton of work just to tear everything down out of courtesy for the other producers, just to set it up again. I would say more than half the records I work on have amp simulated tones on them, and no normal listener would hear the difference. The band is happy, I'm happy, but there is part of me that wishes that last 5% of that magical real tone was on every amp sim record I ever worked on. But now that I'm in my own studio and I plan to build a bigger studio in a year, I'm definitely going with option 3. I'm gonna buy 4 or 5 of my favorite heads, like a triple rec for metal, a rocker verb for pop punk, a JCM 800 for rock, a supersonic head which can take pedals really well, and a Roland 120 for those indie and shoegaze bands. And then I'll probably just have 2 cabs set up with permanent mics on it, so all I have to do is switch the head, plug in my pedals, plug in the guitar, and go. Yeah, it'll be way more expensive than the plug-in and the Quad Cortex, but those real amps are something I can build over time, and if this is what I do, I take it really seriously, so I want to have the best of the best equipment, and I know that those amps will hold their value, if not go up in value over the years. Also, I just really love gear, so it's cool to walk in a room and see all your favorite amps that you always wanted since you were a kid, and you own them and you can make them sound however you want. But that's just me. Do whatever you want to do. Until I start getting some real amps again, I'm still going to be using the plugins and make them sound as great as possible. And if worse comes to worse, I can call a buddy and have him reamp the guitar and throw it on a record. I hope you guys enjoyed that video. Let me know what you think about this style of video and keep up the good work. I'll catch you guys next time.